I'm here with, my name is Don Warner, volunteer for the Community Media Center, and I'm honored to have as subject of interview today, John, and nickname Casey Sterbenz.
Yeah, that is correct, sir.
And I got that right, so
Yes,
I'm off
indeed.
to a good start. John, probably the first thing, how'd you get in the Army? Did you enlist?
Oh, I was drafted.
Drafted.
Drafted. I got my draft notice, and the first thing I did was throw it in the trash. And then a day later, I decided that was not a smart thing to do, so I picked it out of the trash, showed up when I was supposed to, and that was it. I was in the Army.
All of that transpired from the time you threw it in the trash can till the time you were saluting?
Well, I got the notice in May. I was living in Iron Mountain, Michigan at the time, working for a paper company surveying in the woods. And I got the draft notice, went for my physical. When I actually got into the military, it was July 1966.
Right.
When I was working in Upper Michigan, July 3rd, when I got on the train, there was still snow in the woods. On July 5th, when I got off the train in South Carolina, the temperature was in the 90s. So it was quite a shock.
Quite a shock. And South Carolina was the point
Fort
of
Jackson, South Carolina was my mustering in point.
mustering in. And
And then from there to Fort Bragg in
Fort
North
Bragg.
Carolina for basic training.
which we just established you were living again,
Upper Michigan,
Upper Michigan.
the Upper Peninsula of Michigan.
And you had this temperature, culture shock,
Oh,
and
my.
you're in the Army. And,
Temperature and culture shock both. Living out in the woods compared to living in a barracks with everybody else on top of you.
well, were you like any of other family members in service?
I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. My older brother went to West Point. He's a year older than I. He's a West Point graduate, class of 65. And he was in Vietnam at the same time I was. He went over, I think it was November 65, and I went over in January 67. Was 60? Yeah, it was January 67, so he would have gone over in 66.
he
And
went,
he and I overlapped our tours in Vietnam.
So, but you had a fixed enlistment period or draft period, and he was
That is
a
correct.
career.
Yeah, he was a career man.
Yeah.
He finally retired as a lieutenant colonel.
Wow.
He went over twice. He went over first time as a first lieutenant and the second time as a major. And both times, he was straight leg infantry. So he was out in the woods where I was an aircraft engine mechanic working on these things, these Huey helicopters. And I got to sleep in a clean bed every night. I got to have hot showers, hot food, cold beer. My brother was out in the woods eating rations and sleeping in the mud. So I think I got the better of
You
it.
got them. It's kind of a music. Did you get to meet your brother?
Oh,
in,
yes. Yes, when he was heading home after his first tour, since he was an officer, he had freedom of travel. So he looked me up. We had been corresponding. He looked me up. He came and spent an afternoon with me. And that was kind of fun. We swapped war stories. And then I waved goodbye, and he went home, and I stayed on.
And when he come back for his second tour, you
Oh, I was already out of the military by that time.
you were out of the military.
Yeah, I was on a 3-year hitch. I was drafted originally. Then at the induction center, they said, "What do you want to do?" Well, I want to go home.
Second to that.
Second to that, what do I want to do? Okay. I always was afraid I was going to wind up in the infantry. I knew everybody was going to Vietnam. I didn't want to go in the infantry, so I says, okay, send me to school. I'll spend an extra year in the military. So instead of a 2-year hitch, I had a 3-year hitch. But they sent me to Aviation Mechanic School at Fort Eustis, Virginia. So I was able to learn a good mechanical skill at that time, something I could use when I got out of the service.
You were planning ahead.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, my chosen career field is forestry. I had gone to the New York State Ranger School, Forest Ranger School, just before I was drafted. That's how I got to work in the woods in Michigan. I had the training from forestry school. And I figured, well, I got my draft notice, and all this money I was saving to go and finish a college degree, I used that money to buy a private pilot's license. So I figured if I'm in the military, I might as well learn something about aviation, aviation mechanics. That's why I went to aviation mechanic school. Figuring in forestry, I could always use the aviation skills, working out in the woods, flying around, float planes and things like that. So
let's say you're a repair mechanic, like?
yes.
And these would have been Chinooks or?
I worked on the Chinooks, CH-47s. I worked on the Hueys, UH-1B, C, and D model. When I was there, the H model was just coming online. I got to work on the Mohawk observation airplanes, because that's basically the same engine as in the helicopters. I got to work on some reciprocating engines also, the Beaver light transport aircraft. So I got to work on a variety of aircraft,
Wow.
which was really kind of
You've
fun.
got a vast knowledge here.
Yeah.
From an amateur look at this as a viewpoint, the question might be, you're working on helicopters. What's the need to work on them? They're shot up, they're
Most of the time,
failures?
it was normal maintenance. Any machine, like your family car, you can't just drive the thing into the ground. You got to change the oil, change the tires, change the brakes, do a tune-up, do this and that to keep the machine going. With an aircraft, it's the same thing, only of course it's a little more necessary, because you don't want the thing failing when you're up there a couple of thousand feet. So a lot of what we were doing was ordinary maintenance, oil changes, testing different components. Some components were time change items. You had to remove them because they'd reached the end of their useful life and so on. Once in a while, we got to work on things that were shot down.
Maybe you could elaborate on that.
Okay, when I first got to Vietnam, most of the helicopters were coming back in good condition. They'd go out on an operation, they'd come back. The helicopters would be fine, no battle damage. The first month or two I was there, we started seeing bullet holes in the tails of the helicopter. By the time I left after my first year there, the bullet holes had walked their way up into the engine compartments. The Viet Cong were learning how to lead the aircraft. So we were starting to see battle damage. I was specifically an engine man. I was not an airframe man, I was not a rotor man, I was an engine man. We were starting to see some bullet damage in the engine compartment.
Bullet damage as in machine gun?
It could be almost anything.
It
could be an AK-47, it could be some farmer with his rifle. Where do bullets come from? It could be an anti-aircraft 50 cal. Could be almost anything.
And this damage was coming from the Viet Cong or
From the Viet Cong, yeah.
Vietnam Army or regulars?
Well, at the time, I was in the Delta, was in the 4th Corps area. It was Viet Cong. The North Vietnamese were up in 1st and 2nd Corps, up in the north. We were in the south. This was the Viet Cong stronghold, at least until the Tet Offensive. Then the NVA, the North Vietnamese, moved south after the Tet Offensive because the Viet Cong had been wiped out, in spite of what Walter Cronkite had to say. The Viet Cong were basically completely shot. They were gone. There weren't many of them left because we had wiped them out during the Tet Offensive. They shot their bolt and they were defeated. But then the North Vietnamese started moving in because of the propaganda war. Everybody at home thought that we had lost even though we won. So North Vietnamese took advantage of that and started moving south.
You know, The base employed civilian.
That is correct. We had a lot of civilian employees, Vietnamese employees on
from
the
the
base.
population.
Yes.
Communications, and what did they have? I mean, how did they feel about the military? Was there any resentment? Was there any positive? Did you get any interaction
From where
civilians?
I was, it was hard to say. Because you'd never know if somebody was working on the base during the day and was a Viet Cong operative at night. We didn't know. Most of the people with whom I had interaction were working at the post exchange. They were the folks, the clerks, or the bar girls at the off-base taverns. Now, I personally did not go off base very often. I had been warned by one of my uncles who had been in the Pacific in World War II. He warned me that some of the guys he served with in World War II were still in the Philippines. They were not allowed to come home because they had picked up a strain of disease that could not be cured, and they wouldn't let them back in the States for fear of letting the disease loose in the population in the United States. So I took that lesson to heart and stayed on base. I didn't go off base very often. When I did, I worked with one of the chaplains who was teaching English in the grade schools in Vietnam, and I was assisting teaching grade school children how to speak English. I did that maybe a dozen times in the year I was there, went off to assist with that. Other than that, I stayed on base.
When they taught the English, what level, third grade, fourth grade?
Seemed like about middle school.
About middle school. They could acquire that much in what span of time?
Yeah, they...
couple months?
Remember that this had been French Indochina, so French was the main language other than Vietnamese. And English as a second or third language was also taught in the schools. So that these children were fairly literate in English. They could speak it, but they had difficulty reading it. So my job was to hold a book, point to a word, and ask them to pronounce the word. So I'd go from child to child and do this. And then they would, excuse me?
Go ahead, I interrupted.
Oh,
finish your
statement. So they would then take that book, and the whole class would chant the whole sentence. And that would give them a feel for the sound of the language and associate the written word with the sound of the language.
You described that very well. I can almost picture that working, and it sure did. Did adults avail themselves of the English school as well?
I wouldn't have known that.
It was
strictly the school children, the chaplain and his team.
The anticipation to come home or understand what was going on at home, news reach you, morale?
Well, the morale of the soldiers with whom I was associated was pretty good. I don't know if you remember the movie from many years back, a Robin Williams movie, Good Morning Vietnam. Good morning. I was there at that time. And at home, the morale was good because the USO was there. We had Nancy Sinatra came through, some of these other shows. You had our own radio station with our contemporary music. Most of what I read in print was the Stars and Stripes newspaper, so that was all the upbeat stuff. We didn't know, at least I didn't. I didn't pay attention to anything was happening on in the States.
That's fascinating. The USO and the tours, did you get a chance to?
I went to 3 or 4 of the shows. Yeah, the shows would come around. Since I was at an air base, that's the place where the shows would come. So we're right there. Right? Here we go.
Can you recall one or two that stood out?
Yeah, the Nancy Sinatra show, These Boots Are Made for Walking. That was the one that really stands out in my mind.
And second
and that was at the same time when Hanoi Jane was shooting down our helicopters. Here's Nancy Sinatra taking care of the troops. So,
Amen.
You can imagine some of the differences in the emotions compared to the one lady against the other.
We got to watch the film of Bob Hope. Did he ever get to your base? Or?
Not when I was there. He had come through before I got there, and then I imagine he got there afterwards. I did never see a Bob Hope show.
So, so if you hear these boots are made for walking,
that has some pretty good memories. For me. Yeah.
It brings back a flood, I guess, of memories.
Yeah.
When you, the memories of men who served with you, it didn't return.
Well, again, we were behind the lines people, so everybody with whom I actually worked came home in one piece. There were, I mentioned the forest ranger school I attended. 2 of my classmates have their names on the long black wall. One man was the next roommate, and the other fellow was in the other end of the dorm, but I knew both of those men. And there were at least half a dozen of my classmates were wounded but came back alive. Shot up, but still alive.
So you visited the wall once, twice?
I made myself do that. For many years, I could not do that. Until finally I said, this is the day I'm going to make myself do it. And I did. I was between marriages at the time, so I was under some other stress. But I got talking to 2 or 3 folks in our support group, so we all together, 3 or 4 of us, went down to the wall. And I looked up the names of my friends, got the rubbings, and I still have those rubbings. That would have been
that you finally got
1988, 89, somewheres in there.
The wall had been up a couple of years.
The wall had been up a couple of years, yeah. So it
kind of overwhelming to see it for the first time.
Mm-hmm. Just thinking about it now.
Right. Very clear. Yeah.
Yeah, it's still hurts.
Well, you must have formed an opinion while you were there, and then when you came home,
mm-hmm.
And we can
get
a little political as far as you.
Okay, let me
please
talk
go
to
ahead.
all of that. When I was there, if I had come home at the end of my year, I'd have had a year and a half in the service, a year and a half to go. So if I had come back home, 5 or 6 months at home, they'd have sent me back for another year because aircraft mechanic was a highly praised skill. They wanted aircraft mechanic. They needed it because it was a helicopter war. So I says, okay, I don't want to do that. I decided I would extend for another 6 months. And then when that 6 months was over, my time would be too short. They could not send me back again. So as long as I was used to being in country, I said, okay, let's stick it out. So I went over at first, January 67, came home for month's leave, January 68, and watched the whole Tet Offensive on television. So during most of the Tet Offensive, I was not there. I was on leave at home. Then when I went back, everything had changed.
Everything,
it was
atmosphere, morale.
political, everything, because at that time, all the news that I saw on TV, we had such a defeat, we were down, Walter Cronkite puts on his helmet and talks about how we'd gone down. It was a damn lie. We had defeated the Viet Cong soundly. They were destroyed. But the political turn in the United States had gone so anti-war that by that time, then morale was starting to go down the tubes in the military. This was a time when many of the infantry officers during 1968, 69, many of the field officers were being shot in the back by their own people. They were being fragged. Now again, being behind the lines, being an aircraft mechanic, sitting on an airfield all day long, I didn't see that stuff firsthand, but there were always the stories.
The stories of
the disorder and disruption.
They didn't found for nothing. They
Right.
were something to them.
Now there was a very good movie. the siege of Firebase Gloria, which kind of explains the tone of the military guys at that time. Be a good movie to look up and get some idea of what the feel for what was going on.
You want to repeat the name of it for our...
Yeah, the Siege of Firebase Gloria. And Gunny Sargent was the master sergeant who was in charge of this fire base, and he got him whipped in shape in time for being attacked. This was a time around when Khe Sanh was under siege. So this Firebase Gloria was written in that same vein. Here you've got the overwhelming odds of being attacked and surrounded, and the only support you get is a couple of helicopters come in to bring in the bullets and the beans and get you wounded out. So that'll give you a pretty good idea of what the guys in the field were facing at that time. All the time when all the anti-war freaks were saying, we've lost, we've lost. We didn't lose. We gave up. And that hurts.
I'm hearing you.
But, you know, stuff's happening in Iraq today. Stuff's happening in Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Well, Walter,
Yeah, the most
I
trusted,
wasn't going to follow
the most
a
trusted
political,
man in
but,
America, Walter Cronkite.
he would,
No, thank you.
I believe the president said, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost an election. And he did change the political atmosphere.
Oh, did he ever?
I've never heard anybody express it from a veteran's point of view. Thank you. I believe that that the recording of your history varies something, but you know, it's a unique viewpoint that you have from behind the lines and the teaching the English and the interaction. With the regular Vietnam Army,
Okay.
do you have any, you know, training with them, or did they fly the choppers, or?
There were folks in the Vietnamese army who were on our bases, but I did not have any personal interactions with them. Once in a while, we could watch some of the exercises. For instance, there were Vietnamese military firefighting crews that if an airplane crash landed, they would go out with the foam and like that. I watched exercises like that, but I never had a personal interaction with these folks.
So in summary, the Vietnam Army was a good army, or disciplined?
They could have been, but we didn't support them enough. We gave them the training and then left them. And without without even the logistical support from the United States, they didn't have the wherewithal to continue the fight against the North Vietnamese.
And the will back home was growing weaker to keep sending troops
Exactly
and
right.
keep
Exactly
expending the money,
Yep.
and Congress had that ability.
Yep, yep. Now there's another movie out there that kind of expresses that frustration among the military men. It's called The Flight of the Intruder. This is naval aviation doing airstrikes and what those folks had to put up with.
You want to repeat that for the camera?
Okay, this would be The Flight of the Intruder. That's a movie that shows naval aviation doing airstrikes in Vietnam and what these naval aviators had to put up with during that time, during the time when the political will was just going down the tubes.
You've been an excellent subject of an interview. I don't want us to come to a conclusion without giving you the final several minutes to...
That might be a mistake.
we'll risk it. My cameraman's got a lot of patience.
Okay. Well,
Just let it roll. Like,
okay, well, I got out of the Army July 1969 and went back to college at the University of Michigan. I was supposed to attend the University of Michigan because I was living in Michigan at the time I was drafted. So I went back to Michigan, went back to college, and that was around the time, well, a lot of the anti-war protests. University of Michigan was one of the hotbeds of the anti-war protest. I went there to go to school. I didn't pay much attention to a lot of the protests. I just, I had done my job. I didn't want to get these radical fanatics on my tail. I wanted to get my degree and get out of there. So I knuckled down to my studies, went to work. I was a lot better off than many of my classmates because I had a few years under my belt. I had the GI Bill paying most of my bills. I had a paid-for car because after I got out of Vietnam, the summer of '68, I had a year in Fort Benning, 11 months in Fort Benning. It gave me a chance to decompress because it wasn't just like I came out of the battlefield and right back to the street. I had a chance to let things go, get things out, put a few dollars in the bank, get a car, get it paid for, went back to school, got my degrees, got married, went back to the New York State Ranger School and taught for 10 years, and then moved down here to Maryland to attend Bible seminary.
And that's what brought you here?
That's what brought me here. I was
actual Carroll County or Maryland?
In the Capital Bible Seminary in Lanham, Prince George's County.
Prince George's.
I had been a part-time pastor at a local church where I was teaching at Ranger School, and I really felt a call to the ministry, so I moved here to go to Bible college, and unfortunately, my family fell apart at the time. I wound up on the street with 4 kids, no job, and no wife, so I had to go to work. Well, being a veteran, I was able to get work with Department of Defense agencies, and I finally retired from the Department of Defense as a civilian.
So that's an accumulated stress that brought your circumstances about?
Yes, because my wife at the time, she was also a Vietnam veteran. That was how we met in college. She had been a nurse, and she was in country about the same time I was. We didn't know each other then.
Right.
But she was in country the same time I was, and she was the thing that really stressed her was that as a nurse, she was in hospital with all these beautiful young men who had an arm shot off or whose leg was gone.
Right.
So you can imagine the stress that this young woman was going through as a nurse, having to care for these young men. The flower of American manhood getting shot up like that. So there was, I would say, post-traumatic stress on both of our parts.
She represented home to them and so forth.
Yes.
So
yes.
She couldn't disappoint. She had to give herself.
Right. She had to give everything she had of her emotional support to these men whose lives had been shattered by the war.
It's just not the battlefield that came back. It was the support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So our marriage, after 17 years, our marriage fell apart. But we're still in contact. We're still cordial with each other. You know, we raised 4 children. And the children are still in contact with both of us.
Well, I met a lady here when you came in today. I'm meeting you for the first time. It's a pleasure. You introduced me to a lady. You want to talk a little bit about her?
My wife, Judy.
Judy.
Yes, Judy and I have been married now 6.5 years. We met through a professional matchmaking agency, not a computer online thing, but a place where you sit down, you interview, you pay thousands of dollars to get a security background check, a financial background check, and then they decide they'll take you on as a client. Well, we met, and first time we met, after 3 hours at the restaurant, they kicked us out.
Oh.
We hit it right off. So we got married.
Oh, you staying too long.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Without, we had our meal, and 2 hours later we're still, yeah. So 3 months later we got married. We've been married 6.5 years. We're still talking to each other after 6.5 years, which is wonderful.
God bless you. You deserve happiness, man.
My Judy is also a divorced person. Her first husband, was in the Navy in Bermuda doing, well, I'm not sure exactly what, but Judy was also working for the Navy as a civilian, working with the underwater sonar operations that were tracking whales, tracking Russian submarines, things like that. So Judy and I, we have something of a common background since we both have experience with the Vietnam era military service.
She kind of mentioned to me it was an R&R for servicemen.
For her, yeah, well, she would have to speak to that, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Bermuda service, folks who came back from the war but still had time to serve but not enough time to go back overseas, right. They would place them in an organization like that. Again, give them a chance to decompress. And still do a useful job, do some work that was needed, but that you didn't want to take somebody who was combat capable and stick them in a place like that where...
We didn't. Yeah. Her story is too. I heard a little more.
Well, maybe at another time.
Maybe another time in another interview.
That would be another interview.
But thank you. Have we left anything out that you'd like to say to the folks?
Well, I could go on and on about the current political situation.
We'll say we're wrapping in a minute or two.
Well, I'm not very happy seeing people who take a knee in front of the United States flag.
It's your privilege to speak.
These folks have their right to speak, and I don't take that away from them. But I have my right to disagree with them also. And they talk about racial inequality. I would like to see the proportion of black athletes to white athletes on the football teams compared to the proportion of black men to white men in the United States. I know in the NBA, the National Basketball Association, blacks are overrepresented compared to the population, which means for racial equality, we need to add more white men to the teams. I would suspect that is also true in football. If you want to talk racial equality, let's talk a level playing field. Don't denigrate my flag. I hear what you're saying, but don't denigrate my flag. You need to hear what I'm having to say also.
God bless you for your thoughts. And this concludes our interview.